The morning haze over the forward airbase lifted slowly, revealing rows of aircraft lined wingtip to wingtip across the crushed coral ground. Their engines were cold, their bomb racks empty, and their crews quietly preparing for another day they all understood far too well. The war had reached a point where victory depended not only on strength but on precision. And in the crowded skies over active fronts, precision was becoming harder to maintain. Pilots talked openly about the growing risk of friendly aircraft slipping into the wrong lane of advance, of artillery mistakenly striking friendly lines, of escort wings intercepting the very bomber formations they were meant to protect. The front had become fluid, unit boundaries shifted every day, command posts relocated every night, and despite every officer's attempt to monitor changing maps, markers, and reports, errors were increasing. Inside the operations tent, a navigator named Corporal Ellis waited for the briefing to begin. He was young, quiet, and rarely noticed by anyone outside his unit. To most, he was simply another map man, one more figure hunched over charts, pencils, and rulers. But his role placed him at the exact point where poor information became deadly, and he knew something had to change. In recent weeks, he had watched the casualty reports with increasing concern. Friendly fire instances were no longer rare accidents. They were becoming a regular feature of the ongoing operations. Aircraft diving on positions they believed belonged to the enemy, only to discover too late that friendly forces had advanced. Field guns firing on silhouettes they could not confirm. Columns requesting air support only to be attacked by aircraft that misread the grid coordinates by a single square. The official reports tried to assign blame to the fog of war, to communication breakdowns, to rapidly shifting front lines. But Ellis believed the problem was more fundamental. It wasn't that the crews were careless. It was that the system guiding them was not built for the pace of this war. The grid overlays were static while the battlefield was fluid. The map sheets being issued were out of date, sometimes within a day. The pilots flying missions over the same cities and hills had no quick way of seeing how the front line had changed since sunrise. Ellis had spent long hours listening to pilots try to describe where they had attacked, tracing shaky pencil lines across his map as they attempted to remember landmarks from the air. He watched them become doubtful, apologetic, sometimes angered by the burden of guessing wrong. It wasn't just that mistakes were happening. It was that everyone understood those mistakes were going to continue unless something radical shifted. He raised the matter during one of the nightly planning sessions, pointing out inconsistencies between air reports and ground reports. The officers listened politely but did not consider the implications as seriously as he hoped. They trusted the procedures already in place. They acknowledged that friendly fire was an unfortunate part of combat, and while they encouraged him to keep refining the reference maps, they saw no reason to change the system itself. Ellis returned to his desk after the meeting with a quiet sense of urgency. He believed the existing system was creating more confusion than clarity. It had become too dense, too slow, too easily misread under pressure. And when aircraft were approaching a target area at full speed, pilots did not have the luxury of double-checking every coordinate. They needed something they could read instantly, something that removed ambiguity rather than adding to it. He began drafting a new layout on a blank page of tracing paper. Instead of using the traditional grid blocks, he experimented with simplified boundary loops shaped by the actual flow of units on the ground. Instead of relying on static markers, he created movable overlays that could be updated as fast as the front line shifted. He worked late into the night, drawing, erasing, redrawing, measuring distances carefully, and simplifying them further. He reorganized the zones to match the way pilots described the battlefield, rather than the way cartographers usually recorded it. By dawn, he had a rough prototype, simple, stark, and unlike any map the unit had used before. It didn't resemble the official charts. It didn't use standard symbols. It used a method that seemed almost unconventional. He had broken the battlefield into identifiable motion corridors, linking the movement of units to recognizable terrain features, and assigning each corridor a unique identifier that connected air, ground, and artillery in one unified reference. It was the beginning of what others would later call his mad map method. a system that made immediate sense to pilots who had been struggling with the complexity of standard grids. When he brought the idea to his commanding officer, the reaction was cautiously curious. The map was unlike anything expected, but it promised a level of clarity that could reduce misidentification dramatically. The officer agreed to allow a small test during the next day's sorties. Ellis walked back to the tents knowing the responsibility that now rested on him. If the method worked, lives would be saved. If it failed, he would bear the weight of the consequences. But he believed in the system, and for the first time since friendly fire reports had begun rising, he felt that the AMN had a chance to prevent the mistakes that had become all too common. The next morning, as the first aircraft prepared for takeoff, pilots studied the new map quietly. They traced the simplified paths with their fingers, nodding to themselves as they recognized the logic. None of them said much, but the absence of confusion told him everything he needed to know. The early morning briefings were always tense, but on this particular day the atmosphere was different. Every officer present understood that the last 48 hours had pushed the campaign to its limits. Aircraft were flying longer missions, pilots were returning exhausted. Artillery fire was creeping dangerously close to advancing infantry, and in the middle of all of this, the air crews were being asked to strike targets positioned only a few hundred yards from friendly lines. The risk of misidentifying those positions kept growing with every mile the front shifted. The navigator at the center of this story knew this better than anyone. His workspace was a small plotting table inside a vibrating aircraft, and his tools were pencils, grease markers, and thin sheets of weather-worn maps. Nothing about his position gave him authority, and nothing about his rank placed him above others. But his observations over the previous week convinced him that standard procedures were no longer enough. The timing of artillery barrages, the pace of infantry movement, the shifting smoke, the errors in radio relays, all of these factors were colliding in a way that made the battlefield more chaotic than the manuals had ever anticipated. He began by examining the after-action notes from recent missions. The same pattern emerged again and again. Coordinates sent from ground observers were accurate on paper, but delayed by several crucial minutes when transmitted across different units. Pilots receiving those coordinates at altitude were attempting to match them to rapidly changing terrain features. By the time they arrived over the strike zone, friendly forces had often advanced forward, creating a deadly overlap between the intended target and the area now occupied by their own side. This problem was not the fault of any single group. It was a structural flaw created by the speed of the offensive and the limits of communication systems. But to the navigator, the solution did not lie in new equipment or new radios. It had to come from a new method, one that would allow crews to interpret battlefield changes as they happened, rather than relying solely on pre-flight coordinates. He began sketching lines across a map, not to mark targets, but to create reference corridors. These were shapes, not destinations, zones rather than points. He adjusted them repeatedly, erasing and redrawing until they reflected the terrain in a way that allowed him to predict how units on the ground were likely to move within the next 10 minutes. The rough shapes looked chaotic, even messy. But to him, they represented a living picture of the battlefield, something traditional maps failed to capture. Other navigators glanced at his work with curiosity. None of them had ever seen map overlays arranged like that, and at first they didn't quite understand what he was trying to achieve. But he wasn't ready to share the full idea yet. He needed to test it on the next mission, when real conditions, wind drift, smoke, dust, and weather, would reveal whether this new approach had value or whether it was nothing more than a desperate experiment. That next mission came sooner than expected. Reports indicated that friendly armor units had pushed farther ahead than intelligence predicted. Air support was requested to strike a defensive position that enemy forces were fortifying on a small ridge. The coordinates were transmitted with urgency, but as the aircraft crew gathered for their departure, the navigator quietly unfolded his modified map and aligned it beside the standard one. The difference was immediate. The requested strike zone fell near the edge of one of the prediction corridors he had marked. If the armored units continued advancing at their current rate, they would be dangerously close to the bombing run by the time the aircraft arrived. Instead of challenging the order, he made a small adjustment to the flight plan. He recalculated drift, updated escape headings, and prepared a timed reference that he believed would allow them to verify the friendly line's true position before releasing their payload. This adjustment was subtle, and the pilot trusted him enough not to question why he had added a verification marker along the path. When they reached the area, visibility was compromised. Smoke from artillery drifted across the valley. Dust clouds blurred the edges of the ridge. The pilots scanned for recognition panels, but none were visible from their altitude. Ground units reported they were still behind their marked safe line, but the navigator's reference corridor indicated otherwise. He leaned forward, studied the terrain, and matched it to the irregular shapes he had drawn the night before. The contours aligned precisely with the prediction zone he feared would overlap friendly positions. The radio crackled with pressure from ground command to proceed, but the navigator calmly instructed the pilot to hold for 10 seconds, then another 10. Finally, shadows emerged through the haze. Friendly armor, far ahead of where they were supposed to be, had moved into the very area targeted for destruction. The strike was aborted with only seconds to spare. Later, when the aircraft returned to base, the crew learned the truth. The armor column had advanced almost twice as fast as predicted. If the bombing run had proceeded as ordered, the result would have been catastrophic. Dozens of vehicles, along with their crews, would have been struck by their own side. The navigator's improvised map method had prevented what would have been a devastating friendly fire incident. He didn't celebrate. He simply folded his map and began marking new shapes, refining the idea further, because he understood that one successful avoidance was not enough. The pace of the campaign was increasing, and with it the risk of misidentification. If a single improvised method had saved one unit, a perfected version might save many more. Word of his decision spread quickly among the squadron. Pilots listened closely. Ground officers took note. Some praised his caution. Others quietly wondered whether the mission should have proceeded anyway, but nobody dismissed his method entirely. They had all seen how close they had come to a disaster. And the navigator knew this was only the beginning. The front line was widening, new terrain was complicating operations, and more units were entering the theater each day. If his method was to be useful, it had to adapt, grow, and become something that other crews could use without needing to watch him personally trace every line. That night he stayed awake longer than usual, reorganizing his map overlays, adjusting the prediction corridors, and experimenting with new ways to simplify the system. He wasn't trying to invent something brilliant. He was simply trying to prevent the next mistake, a mistake he knew could cost hundreds of lives. The first field trials of the navigator's method revealed something unexpected. Crews who had never flown together before, who normally needed hours of coordination just to establish a shared mental picture of the route, were suddenly operating as if they had trained for months. The visual rhythm of the layered circles, the bold axis lines, and the repeating orientation marks gave every crewman an immediate anchor. Even in turbulence, even when the lights flickered, even when the intercom stuttered with static, they could look down at the map and instantly know whether they were drifting left or right, early or late, tight or wide. It eliminated the long pauses and verbal corrections that often caused confusion at critical moments. The operations officers studying the early missions noticed something else. Radio traffic dropped dramatically. Crews needed fewer position checks, fewer clarifications, and fewer mid-air corrections. They were flying cleaner routes, maintaining more consistent altitude corridors, and arriving at designated target runs with almost no vector deviation. For the first time in months, the operations log did not list a single report of a wrong-turning squadron wandering into another group's bombing lane. The absence of those incidents was so striking that commanders began circling those logs to show senior leadership. It was the first measurable sign that the new system worked. But the real test came on a morning when the weather collapsed faster than forecast. A storm front rolled through their operational corridor, turning the sky into a grey void. The horizon disappeared into a seamless wall of vapor. Crosswinds pushed the formation sideways, and the heavy vibration of the engines made instruments quiver. Under any previous navigation system, this would have been a perfect setup for disaster. Planes would drift without realizing it. Bomb runs would layer over one another. Friendly positions below could easily have been mistaken for enemy strongholds. In more than one past operation, confusion under these same conditions had led to tragic friendly fire errors. Inside the lead aircraft, the navigator felt the same pressure everyone else did. The pilot was calling out instrument fluctuations. The bombardier was double-checking bearings. The radio operator kept receiving partial fragments from crews reporting turbulence, but the navigator remained steady. He laid the map flat, locked his sightline to the central reference marks, and began his sequence. Every 30 seconds he recalculated drift. Every 30 seconds he adjusted the reference arcs. Every 30 seconds he updated the pilot with clear, concise commands. There was no hesitation. There was no second guessing. The system gave him all the feedback he needed. Outside, the planes held their formation through the storm. The pilots, who could barely see 10 yards ahead, reported that they were following his adjustments precisely. They trusted him because his corrections were consistently small, measured, and predictable. No harsh turns, no sudden altitude demands, just a smooth, constant easing back into alignment every time crosswinds pulled them away. What would have become a chaotic zigzag of guesswork became a controlled glide through a clouded corridor. 30 minutes later, when they broke through the far edge of the storm, the squadron officers checked their positions and could hardly believe it. Every aircraft was exactly on the plotted line. Not one had drifted into a neighboring squadron's sector. Not one had crossed into the no-strike zones where friendly ground forces were maneuvering. For the first time in their unit's operational history, a full formation had flown through a visibility zero storm without a single misalignment report. Word spread fast. Ground commanders noticed immediately that no confirm your target calls were needed that day. Anti-air batteries did not file any confusion reports. Field units did not request emergency location clarifications. Everything downstream of the navigation chain operated more smoothly because the formation had held perfectly upstream. The navigator did not celebrate. He simply made notes on what to refine next. That was his nature. He was not chasing recognition. He was chasing reliability. The next major operation pushed the method into even more dangerous territory. Intelligence officers expected multiple friendly divisions to be moving beneath the flight path. At least 2 armored brigades were operating in loose proximity to enemy forces, which meant the risk of misidentification was enormous. A single bombing run slightly off target could have struck advancing friendly armor. The stakes were high, the terrain complex, and the atmospheric conditions unstable. As formations assembled over the rally point, the navigator reviewed every reference mark he had created. His circular overlays were clean and unbroken. His orientation arrows lined neatly with compass bearings. His drift correction intervals were marked with consistent spacing. He was ready, but he also understood the weight of this operation. Preventing even one friendly fire strike mattered. Preventing many could shift the course of the campaign. When the lead plane called the vector change, he began computing again, his pencil gliding across the page with steady confidence. He wasn't improvising. He was repeating a system that had already proven itself in chaos. The pilot listened closely, adjusting throttle and heading in small but precise increments. Meanwhile, the crews behind them mirrored those movements. The rhythm of the formation became almost mechanical. Every turn matched, every correction aligned. The entire formation felt as if they were connected by invisible threads drawn across his map. Halfway through the route, a surprise crosswind struck from the north. Aircraft jolted sideways. For a moment, crews braced for disorder. Old habits told them that these conditions always meant trouble, but then the corrected call came from the lead navigator. The adjustments were clear and measured. Drift factors were recalculated instantly. Pilots eased into their new headings, trusting the method. The formation flexed like a single organism recovering its balance. The crews felt the tension lift as the navigation stabilized. Down below, friendly armor units continued their advance, unaware of how close danger had come. The bomber stream overhead passed exactly along the intended corridor, not 20 yards off course but precisely centered. Observers on the ground later remarked that it was the cleanest, most perfectly aligned bomber procession they had ever seen. No staggering, no drifting, no confusion, just smooth, predictable motion across the sky. Radio logs from that day showed something astonishing. Not a single hold fire, verify target, or abort run message was transmitted due to identification uncertainty. In operations like this, such messages were normally constant. That silence told the entire story. The Navigator's method had eliminated the root causes of misidentification, drift, misalignment, and timing inconsistency. With those variables removed, the mission became safer not just for the air crews, but for every friendly soldier on the ground. After landing, crews gathered around the Navigator not to congratulate him, but to ask questions. They wanted to understand how he had predicted the drift so quickly, how he had maintained the formation stability under constant pressure, how he had known which adjustments were necessary and which were risky. He explained that nothing he did was instinct. It was all structure, rhythm, and repetition. The system worked because the system removed uncertainty. Commanders began tracing through the unit's data logs. They compared missions before and after the Navigator's introduction of the method. The pattern became undeniable. Where there had once been near misses and miscommunication, there was now clarity. Where friendly units once filed close call reports, names now appeared in the column marked no incidents. Within only a few operations, the cumulative effect of his method had prevented more than a dozen potential friendly fire scenarios. Analysts projected that fully implemented, the method could prevent hundreds. Late that evening, as the crews prepared for another mission, the Navigator sat over his map one more time. He did not see lines and circles. He saw the lives of the ground troops beneath each flight path. He understood that navigation was not just geometry or timing, it was stewardship. Every correction he made could protect someone he would never meet. Every arc he adjusted might keep a unit safe from accidental harm. The responsibility weighed on him, but it also strengthened him. He knew now that the method was not just effective, it was necessary. The briefing room was silent except for the low hum of the projector. Maps spanned the walls, whole continents stretched flat, cities compressed into dots, roads into thin scratches. But what held every officer's attention wasn't a city or a supply route, it was a single line. A curved line. A line that no one had drawn and no one could explain. It was smooth, elegant, and strangely deliberate. Yet it didn't match any coastline, any railway, any elevation gradient, or any known military boundary. It cut across the map in a long arc that looked almost accidental, as if a pencil had slipped. And yet it wasn't random. It ran through three of the most dangerous sectors, areas where friendly and enemy aircraft regularly crossed paths, usually with disastrous results. The commander looked at it for nearly a minute before speaking. "What is this supposed to be?" 5 heads turned toward the Navigator who had first noticed it. He hesitated, carefully choosing his words. "It's a strike path that hasn't happened yet," he said quietly, "but all the conditions for it are already in place." The room stayed silent. He stepped closer to the wall map and placed a translucent sheet over it. Each pilot recognized the symbols immediately: ordnance drop paths, flight corridors, artillery fan ranges, and forward observer call grids. They were familiar, even comforting. They were the rules, the geometry that kept the war from consuming its own troops. Then the Navigator added his own markings, not the usual pre-approved symbols, but soft pencil notations, marginal scribbles, and angular measurements that seemed to defy standard doctrine. He wasn't predicting enemy movement. He wasn't tracking friendly units. He was mapping error. Every wrong report, every delayed message, every misaligned compass, every pilot flying a few seconds too fast or too slow, every gun crew whose calibration drifted by half a degree. None of these errors mattered on their own. But when plotted together, something terrifying appeared. The curved line. A shape formed not by command, but by chaos. A consistent arc produced by hundreds of small operational deviations, all pointing toward a single future state, a strike corridor where friendly aircraft risked being mistaken for hostile silhouettes. No one sees this line because no one thinks the mistakes can add together, the navigator said softly. They think small errors die on their own, but they don't. They migrate, they merge, they move. His pencil tapped the board where the arc crossed the front line. And eventually, they crossed the worst possible place. The officers leaned in, studying the curve with newfound dread. They weren't looking at an enemy threat. They were looking at their own blind spot, a product of familiar routines, flawed assumptions, and trust placed in systems that were never designed for perfection. "Show me where it happens first," the commander finally said. The navigator flipped a second sheet onto the board, this one filled with projected time windows. "If nothing changes," he replied, "friendly bombers will enter this misidentified corridor within 72 hours. Another sheet. And artillery observers will mistake their altitude. Another. And an anti-aircraft regiment will have just received orders to fire on anything in this strip." The room grew colder despite the heat of the lamps. He stepped back. "This," he said, pointing to the arc, "will not look like a mistake when it happens. It will look deliberate, and we will lose hundreds of men in a single hour." The crew grew accustomed to the navigator's quiet presence at the plotting table. They no longer questioned why he always checked whether sheets twice or why he stared at the map long after everyone else had gone to sleep. They simply learned that if he was awake, the aircraft was safer than it had ever been before. And as more missions passed without a single accidental strike, word began to spread beyond the squadron. Other crews wanted to know how their missions ran so cleanly. They wanted to know how their bombs never drifted into friendly sectors, how no shells ever landed where Americans or allies were fighting, and how not a single report of mismarked targets came from their runs. But he never gave them a full explanation. Not yet. He knew the method only worked if every navigator adopted it fully. Half measures would cause chaos. Incomplete versions would create inconsistency. And inconsistency in aerial warfare killed people. What he did share were results. He spoke plainly in mission briefings about the patterns he saw. He showed how 2 degrees of drift, combined with a crosswind and a rushed pilot call, could place ordnance hundreds of yards into the wrong grid. He explained that most friendly fire disasters did not stem from recklessness but from assumptions. Someone assumed the wind was the same as yesterday. Someone assumed the aircraft's position was exact even though cloud cover had masked landmarks for 30 minutes. Someone assumed the ground forces were where they were supposed to be. The navigator never assumed. His map method forced him to verify every single time. The squadron commander eventually called him in for a private conversation. He wanted to know how many friendly fire incidents the navigator believed his method had actually prevented. The navigator hesitated. He did not want to exaggerate, so he took the mission logbook, opened it to the earliest entries, and began counting each time his corrections prevented the aircraft from striking the wrong grid. He counted every time he had realigned the bomber away from a friendly battalion, every time he updated a pilot who was flying blind through cloud layers, every moment in which he saw misdrawn coordinates that would have caused disaster. When he finished, the number was staggering. The commander said nothing at first. Then he told him to continue using the method exactly as he had been. Soon the requests came from outside the squadron. Other groups wanted his corrections for their maps. Other navigators wanted his grid overlays. Commanders wanted confirmation that their aircraft were not about to bomb their own infantry. He found himself working longer hours, drawing more precise overlays, comparing more operational maps. Every time he completed a set, he added a tiny mark in the corner, a silent reminder to himself of one potential friendly fire strike removed from history. The method was still evolving. He refined it with every mission. He discovered that marking time intervals too closely together caused clutter, so he adjusted spacing. He learned that using 3 points of verification, not 2, eliminated small but fatal errors in aircraft drift. He found that updating pilots at predictable intervals helped maintain flight discipline during chaos. These small refinements added up, quiet improvements that no one saw but that every crew benefited from. The pilots trusted him completely by now. When he called out a correction, they followed it without hesitation. When he updated wind drift, they adjusted instantly. And when he quietly said that a turn needed to happen now, they turned. His voice became a stabilizing force in the chaos of combat operations. He never raised it, he never rushed. He simply spoke, and the aircraft aligned itself with safety. But even as confidence grew, the Navigator faced a new challenge. A large operation was forming. Multiple bomber groups, dozens of aircraft, overlapping attack routes, and a ground advance happening faster than planners could redraw their operational maps. The margins for error were shrinking by the hour. Lines on the map were shifting constantly. What was a safe strike zone in the morning could become a friendly front line by afternoon. It was the exact kind of operation where friendly fire incidents historically surged. He studied the preliminary strike plan long after others left. The more he examined it, the more he saw risk. The grids overlapped dangerously. The formations were spaced too tightly. Clouds were predicted for the central corridor, which meant visual confirmation would be difficult. The ground units were advancing faster than expected, which meant bombing delays could place the friendly troops directly under the ordnance path. He knew that one wrong estimate, one misaligned coordinate, one misheard radio call could lead to catastrophe. So he began recalculating everything. He cross-referenced the latest reports from the ground. He recalculated drift across each bomber corridor. He verified the altitude layers for every formation. And then he overlaid his own map method across the entire plan. The errors jumped out immediately. The altitude stack had been drawn incorrectly in one segment. A rendezvous marker had been shifted due to cloud adjustments. And one of the primary strike routes, if flown exactly as published, would cross directly over friendly armor. He brought his corrections to the commander. He explained the consequences plainly. The commander listened, took the marked overlays, and ordered an immediate revision to the entire operation. Pilots were awakened. Navigators were briefed again. The strike was delayed only minutes, but the changes rippled across every participating aircraft. No one outside the planning room knew how close they had been to disaster, but the Navigator knew. His method had prevented not just one friendly fire incident, but dozens at once. During the mission, clouds closed in exactly as predicted. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Pilots flew by instruments alone, trusting that the navigators behind them could keep the aircraft aligned. Radio channels filled with position reports, drift updates, and elevation calls. And through it all, the navigator remained steady. Every few minutes he updated the pilot. Every few minutes he recalculated drift. His tone never changed. The target emerged from the cloud layer exactly where he predicted. The bombing run was clean. The formations passed over friendly lines with safe margins. When they returned, the mission was reported as one of the most precise coordinated strikes in the theater. Not a single friendly unit had been hit, despite the chaos and the weather and the confusion on the ground. It was only later, when he sat alone in the quiet plotting room, that he allowed himself to consider the scale of what had happened. Not one error, not one misplaced grid, not one bomb falling where it should not have. The number of averted friendly fire strikes continued to rise, and he marked another silent tally in his notebook. The method he developed, born from frustration, refined in silence, and executed with discipline, was now shaping the safety of thousands of men who would never know his name. He knew the war would not end quickly. There would be more operations, more confusion, more shifting lines on maps that could cause deadly mistakes, but he also knew that the method worked. It worked under pressure, it worked in bad weather, it worked when radio clarity disappeared, and as long as it worked, he would continue using it. Each tally in his notebook was a life spared. Each corrected grid was a disaster erased before it could begin. And as long as the missions continued, so would he.